The monsters are due on Maple Street. I had a conversation with somebody once. It's been years back. Um, I had finished the poetry book but was working on the children's book. This gentleman wrote some on the side. Then he wrote some short stories. I read one of them. It was pretty good. And I said, don't ever, let that art go to waste. Use it. He said, but what I do is not really like art. He said, what I do is more like screenwriting or writing a TV show. And he said, and that's not art. If you consider that art, that's the same as calling comic books art. Well, if a comic book isn't art, I don't know what is. To me, it's almost the perfect combination of two arts, of multiple arts, multiple disciplines. I'm not a huge comic book person. I don't really read them any longer. I never did get huge into them. The last one that really caught my attention was an X-File comic, and it was just because it was a continuation of the show that I had loved for so long. But if you've ever seen a David Lynch television show, or and you can argue that TV isn't art, or TV can't be art. Just because you don't understand something doesn't mean it's not art. Just because you don't appreciate something doesn't mean it's art. And just because you appreciate something doesn't mean you understand it, because there's things I look at in awe and wonder and still don't completely understand occasionally. Such is life and such is art. But to me, television is very much art. And some television shows have a way of doing and saying things that are very impactful on me. One such show is the original Twilight Zone. It's a great show. So many great episodes, so many classics. I watched it again, most of it. I'm 2 seasons in. And I've watched these first 2 seasons again for probably the 30th time throughout my life. A lot in the last 5 or 6 years. It's just something that occasionally I'll go back doing and binge watch almost every single episode all the way through. Occasionally there's an episode here or there I'll skip, one that just didn't impact me the way that the others did, but for the most part I'll make it through all of them. And I have favorites. One of my top 3 favorites of all time is an episode entitled The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. Let me explain this episode to you. Here we are in a suburb, for the times a very affluent suburb, upper middle class, or middle class at best, I don't know, somewhere in there. Nice homes, nice people. The type of neighborhood where everybody knows everybody. They know everybody maybe a little too well, but everybody knows everybody. All of a sudden the power goes out. Not only does the power go out, but, spoiler warning, if you're wanting to watch this, you probably don't want to listen to this first. Go watch the episode, then come back and listen to this, because I'm going to tell you the whole episode. Okay. The power goes out. All machinery quits. Cars, lawnmowers, everything. Today's rationality is the equivalent of an EMG. Or EMP, I'm sorry, EMG. It's a good pickup if you're into guitars. It's equivalent to an EMP, an electromagnetic pulse, taking out, anything electronic. The neighborhood folks get together and determine this is unusual, especially considering lawnmowers and everything have quit. They devise a plan that one of them's going to leave and go a couple streets over and see if there's power. The car won't start, and they realize then that the cars aren't working. And a young boy, who coincidentally enough had been reading comic books, tells them a little yarn, a little science fiction. He had seen something pass over, a ship, something of that sort. And he tells them how, in the books he reads, once that ship crosses over, things like this happen. And that ship will shut them off from the rest of the world and come and take them hostage, and the aliens will take over. They laugh, they scoff, but then he plants another little seed in their mind. He points out that often when this occurs, the aliens, prior to landing and infiltrating and taking over everything you know and love and hold dear, they often send someone beforehand. They'll look like you, walk like you, talk like you, but they'll very much be alien. And you won't know it, and they'll give them all the inside information on you, making their conquest of you even easier. The boy tells the neighbors this, and long story short, they go and start to suspect one another and implicate one another, and with no real evidence, with no real change, with just slight manipulations, lights coming on and off in certain people's houses, certain people's cars starting and dying, and all that in one day without power, with the smallest little seed planted by a child who read a comic book. These people learned to distrust the neighbors they knew so well, too well. They learned to distrust them. They attacked them. They shot and killed one. And we're in the middle of complete and total pandemonium by the end of the episode. Now it turns out, it really was aliens. And they were running an experiment, and one alien was showing another alien, hey, if we take all these things from them, every time we do it, they'll turn on each other. They look for the most dangerous thing around them, for the most dangerous enemy, and they concentrate on that. And in most situations, in almost all, humans are the most dangerous thing in the environment. They are instantly the enemy you need to watch. It's a black and white TV show made before the 24-hour news cycle, made before the internet, made before mass communication of the level at which we operate now, before the iPhone, before the iPad, before the personal computer, before the laptop, the desktop, before the Mac. It's a thought experiment on a small scale. And I watched it when I was younger. I remember seeing it for the first time on a video cassette. I don't remember if this is something that somebody had taped and I got a hold of, or how I come across this. But this is one of 5 episodes that was on that. And 3 of my favorite episodes, maybe because they were 3 of the first 5 I ever seen, were on that tape. But this was taped directly off TV. I watched that. I don't know how old I was, 11 maybe. And I thought it was a good, fun, entertaining, interesting thing. But I thought people can't do that to other people. It doesn't work that way. I watch that now as an adult. I won't divulge my age because I'm younger than my wife, and it's hard for her to hear those numbers. But I'm not yet 40. She almost is. But look at that now in a society post-internet, post-social media, post-iPhone, post-iPad, MacBook, PC, 24-hour news cycle. Look at that and I go, aha. Was this life imitating art before life had caught up with art? Was it simple prediction? Was that a very true statement of the times, and I was just not there to experience them? And it was. See, I saw this in the 90s, and I saw this through the eyes of an innocent child. I didn't see this as someone during or after the Red Scare, where lots of people in Hollywood were being considered communist, despite their real beliefs, but just sometimes out of fear and false accusations and numerous things that could result in someone being considered a communist and being blackballed from Hollywood. Or when the Americans put Japanese in imprisonment camps during the World War because they were afraid they were like the Japanese they were fighting in Japan. Or during the Cold War of the 80s, and the nuclear scare. Or the nuclear scare under Kennedy. It's happened in the past. That past just wasn't my future. It wasn't my life. It wasn't my present. It wasn't something that I was familiar with and something that I could really associate with, identify with. Because to me, up to that point, the world was perfect and jolly. And if you've listened to my other podcasts, I've already done hours on how good the world is, but the world is getting better. It has much room for improvement. I look at this now and I see the obvious reflections of those same fears that I see in this television episode apparent in real life. And I see these actions that these people took and this distrust and this fear and turning your back on your neighbor with no real evidence, no real proof. It's happened time and time again in the U.S. and across the world. It's hard for me to speak as intelligently about other parts of the world because I don't live there. But the U.S., it's fairly easy for me to look. It's easy for me to look at cancel culture. It's easy for me to look at a lot of different things in our modern society and go, aha. Those are the monsters. The fictitious monsters, the fake monsters. The monsters we as humans create and make the face of those monsters our neighbors out of fear and selfishness, out of fear for our own safety. We vilify sometimes people the closest to us. We often do that, actually. But it's becoming more publicized. Maybe not more prevalent, but more publicized. See, gossip to an extent works that way. It's the kindling that can start something like this. But now we have the advent of a very public life. And people take things that are posted and take things that are said and take things that are written and twist them and distort them. And freedom of speech is challenged so often now that you don't have the right to just simply have an opinion in many cases. In many cases, your opinion is instantly wrong. Especially if that opinion, and mostly if that opinion is not, let's say, in line with the perceived majority. Now, the perceived majority is an interesting thing. Your opinion may very well, if it's an online opinion, be in line with the actual majority. Or at least it will be unconcerning to the majority because the majority sees it as your opinion and it has no value outside of being your opinion. No matter how negative a value or how positive a value you put on it or any group. But the perceived majority is the group with the loudest voice. And online, that actually is the minority. The people with the most radical, most ignorant, most atrocious beliefs have the loudest voice. Because oftentimes they have the most time to speak, the most time to respond, the most time to interact. But most importantly, they have the least self-confidence and the most fears. And that seems to make for pretty vocal monsters. We don't need aliens to come right now in the United States and turn us against one another. We do that fairly well ourselves. Our government does that very well. Not a concerted movement or action by any one branch of the government to disrupt American life. Actually, it's to the contrary. Most branches of the government work extremely hard to keep a coherent and cohesive unit in America that can work together and be productive. On the other hand, the two-party system feeds very well off of manipulation and disinformation, and they feed very well off of witch hunts and large groups of people with torches chasing down monsters. You see, it gives people something to believe in, something to get behind. If they believe in that thing, it motivates them to support that and to stand against that. If they don't believe in it, but they fear that they'll be seen for not believing, and that in turn will be just as disruptive in their life, then they'll falsely persecute someone and they'll falsely follow, even though it's something they don't believe, but they do so out of fear. It's an amazing thing to watch life imitate art. Art that's decades old. Art that didn't know the world that I see before me. It shows me two things. It shows me that world, in a lot of ways, the world that was written in, had to have elements of the world that I live in now. Elements in the sense of not being the same technologically, but being the same socially. People are people. Another good line from another episode, but we won't get into that one right now. See, if a group of people gather and they falsely accuse someone of something, but they do so adamantly, and they do so with no regard for the truth, no respect for proof or the perceived innocence before someone is found guilty. They do so just out of fear, or they do so maybe out of desire to be something or to be perceived as something or someone that they're truly not, to be perceived as better than they really are, when in fact they're just proving that they're worse than they think they are. And oftentimes that group attacking this person, they end up making this person a monster to many and a martyr to others. Now, the relevance of the person at this point is gone. The person can be completely guilty, even though it appears that they're not. Or the person can be a horrible person in a completely different way. And not in this instance. But it doesn't matter. No. The tarring and feathering has begun. And that usually breeds the counter reaction. A group who will definitely defend the rights and innocence of this person, regardless of fact. Regardless of innocence or guilt. Then it becomes two groups blindly battling each other over an ideal. An ideal that is grossly inaccurate. An ideal that's portrayed in a grossly inaccurate way from both sides. An ideal that's true meaning falls somewhere in the middle of these two groups, but they have to push it as far their way as possible. They've become the monsters. Now, this is obvious in certain groups that I consider terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Obviously, they're going to do these types of things. They're a terrorist group. They may even believe that what they do is right. Ignorance is a powerful thing. It's possible. Or Antifa, an American terrorist group. They may believe what they do is right, but ignorance is bliss. You expect these things out of these groups of people, but that's not the type of people that concern me. Cancel culture and woke culture and things of that nature are bringing out new monsters. It's getting masses of people who are not bad people. They're not horrible people. They're not racist and terrorists. They're just normal people. They're normal people who want acceptance. They're normal people who have tons of fear. And they're people who are allowing themselves to become rebel rousers and allowing themselves to fall for beliefs not truly their own, but popular. And they are trying to influence free speech and free thought. They're trying to squash debate. They're trying to get everything down to one collective belief. The problem is, nobody's going the same direction. There's no middle point. There's no meeting point. They're going in all various directions. It's a group of individuals who have vastly different beliefs, but are trying to centralize on one. All that they know is they have to attack anything and everything that for the moment is different than them. It's even scarier that organizations get in on it now, large companies. What social media does in banning some people and not others, and shadow banning people without saying it, and how they control, but in a legal and sanitary way, what shows up in people's feeds and what does not. How they allow access to advertisers and allow advertisers to dictate what you see. That's a double-edged sword. That is somewhat how the free market, well, that is how the free market works. If someone doesn't want to advertise on something because they disagree with it, you have every right to that. And if that information provider, regardless of the medium, decides that they don't want to share that information because they don't want to lose that advertiser, they have every right. The problem is those decisions, those influences, making those things bad and naughty, and words and phrases and thoughts that should not be uttered. Well, that's being perpetrated by a very vocal, very loud minority. A very centralized group of monsters. But it's being perceived, or not, by business as the majority. I don't put that much good faith in business. I think that big business would back horrible, horrible things and ideals if it made them money. And they would back beautiful, wonderful things and ideals if it made them money. It's a scary thing, free speech. It's a necessity. It's needed. It's a beautiful thing. But it allows for people we don't want to hear speak to be able to speak. And if we go back to the original ideal, these people allowing themselves out of fear and uncertainty and outside influence to become monsters. That's a dangerous, dangerous thing. I don't remember the podcast, but I believe we have talked about this before. I know I talked to a gentleman who was a veteran, not of the World War, but was a veteran. And he had a commanding officer who had been a veteran of the World War. And he said to me that his commanding officer had this almost obsession with Adolf Hitler, and it was puzzling to him in a lot of ways. And this gentleman was in Vietnam, and there was a lot of bad things happen to soldiers when they come back from Vietnam, and I don't think anybody wanted to be in that war. I don't think the soldiers wanted to be in that war. Well, no, they didn't. You know, we had to draft people. It was not a popular war in any way, shape, or form. But he looked at how people blamed him in particular. He didn't want to go. He didn't enjoy what he did, and he had no qualms in saying he wasn't happy about representing his country in that way. To the contrary, he was very unhappy about it. It was a very uncomfortable time in his life. And he kept in contact with that commanding officer, who never actually went to Vietnam. He'd met, I don't know if he'd met him through boot camp or what, but he had met him in the States. And when he come back to the States, he sent him a letter, contacted him, and they talked once or twice after that. And I wasn't there. I can't say that this is the situation. But he said his commanding officer was under the impression that that war had been politicized. Politicized to a point to where neither party could back it, neither party could touch it, but neither party could pull out of it. And that a small minority of people had pushed for that war, and a small minority of people had made that war happen. And a small minority of people had benefited from that war. That made a majority of people feel out of control. And that turned a majority of people who didn't want that war, didn't want that situation. And it split them in half. Some felt an even stronger need to back the country in that time, even though they felt like the country was doing something wrong. And the others felt a strong need to punish the country, to punish those soldiers. He said it was amazing to him what that small group of people were able to do in regards to tearing a country in half, and in regards to putting a country that almost as a whole, including presidents such as Kennedy, who didn't want to go to Vietnam, and put them in a war they didn't want to be in. That was the power of fear. That was the power of suggestion. And, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which Kennedy was directly involved in, is an even better example of fear and misinformation turning a group of people from one opinion to the other. We talked on a different occasion, myself and that veteran, about his CEO, his commanding officer, trainer, whoever it was, and his reading of Mein Kampf. He was the first person that ever told me, you need to read Mein Kampf. It's an ugly book written by an ugly man, but it lets you in, it lets you see who this man was, what this man was. And that's true. I think that's valid, and I think that's true. But he was able to use fear and disinformation to turn a socialist leftist party into one of the most right-wing parties of all time, in the Nazi Party, and to turn a whole country against one single ethnicity, race, religion of people, in the Jews. One man was able to do that. All he had to do was control the fears of the people around him, and he could turn them into monsters. The media does that with us. I feel like this is a pretty good follow-up to be within a couple podcasts, or the podcast about how the world's getting better, because it's important to remember that. The media isolates us. It splits us in two. It divides us in two. One side of the media would tell you that the left is trying to take your freedom of speech. And the other side of the media would tell you that the left is trying to protect people, and people who aren't able to protect themselves. The thing is, I believe that both of those sides are equally trying to limit what you can say, what you can believe, and who you can support. It's hard to get in an office, or it's hard to get the vote on something in the House or in the Senate, and to do the bidding of the people who paid your way into office if the options are so spread out, and if free speech and free thought is allowed for so many different options. But if you can cut that down, if you can narrow that down, simplify that, turn it from gray to black and white, then you can control that much easier, regardless of the party. And how do you do that? You make monsters. And those monsters, they turn on each other. In chaos, much like on Maple Street. The two aliens running the experiment, far from harm's way. And they made a very clear statement. We will go from city to city, from neighborhood to neighborhood, and do the same thing until they destroy themselves. I don't think our situation's that dire. Again, I think the world's getting better. But I think we, as a perceived free society, and one that has been very free throughout the years, more free than many others, we need to learn to appreciate that freedom. We also need to be willing to protect it. Be willing to agree with people we disagree with, or at least support them when they want the ability to speak, so that we can assure they'll support us when we want the ability to say something they disagree with. We don't want to let outsiders, to let countries outside of the United States, to let leaders inside the United States, or to let religions put a wedge between us as humans. If we turn on our neighbors and we fight each other, trying to figure out who's the alien, the aliens will just wait for us to destroy each other. Often when I do these, I do them off the top of my head. Unless it's one that takes statistics and facts, I'll sit down and write out those statistics and facts. This one and one other, or two others maybe, I've sat down and kind of pre-wrote, got a general idea of what I was thinking because I had a thought in my mind, and I wanted to try to stay true to that thought and stay true to the process. And I read through this one numerous times, and sometimes it seems convoluted, and sometimes it seems like it's going in 10 different ways. And I recorded it once and scrapped it, and I sat and recorded this the second time, and I feel like there's variances. There's times when I've got off point and moved, and it doesn't make sense, but I think if you really think about what I'm saying, it ties together, and it serves a purpose. And you do not have to agree with me. That's the beauty of free speech. That's the beauty of free thought. If you don't agree with me, I won't rally the neighbors against you. I won't come at you with pitchforks. I won't shoot you on a dark street as you walk towards me out of fear of what may be coming. I'll simply listen try to understand. Try to let you change my mind. Validate that mind change against information and facts and thoughts and beliefs that I hold dear. And weigh the outcome and either way on the other side. I appreciate you for who you are. Those aliens in that episode, they did nothing. They physically did nothing to alter those people. All they did was initiate a simple disruption in their daily lives. Isolate them. Take away all the things, the comforts that they had, and all the things that connected them, their phones, their radios, to the outside world, and left them amongst themselves with the implanted thought that someone wasn't who they said they were. I don't want to be those people in that scenario. I don't want to be the aliens in that scenario. I want to be the people who go and help their neighbor instead of hunt their neighbor. And I believe that for the majority of people, that's who you are. It's what you are. And I believe that Americans, as citizens, no matter how ugly our party's system may be, Americans as citizens are very much that same way, the majority of people. Send me your emails and stuff. I've got a lot lately, and I really like getting those. And I've been in contact with a lot of people. But give me your thoughts on these episodes and what you think and like. And see you next time.